Whether you're building a keyboard, upgrading a keyboard, or even just looking at keyboard parts, I think we've all been at that point where we realize that there are too many damn switches on the market. There are outrageously expensive ones like Xylence that cost $1.30 a piece, and then there are the super budget-friendly Gateron switches that cost only 20 cents a piece. But does the price really dictate the quality? Let's talk about it. I've always been someone who cares a lot about getting the best bang for your buck while showing you guys the best products to buy while saving you money. And for switches, it's quite rare for a super expensive switch to give that much more to the typing experience compared to a budget switch. But of course, there are exceptions to this, which is why it is sometimes reasonable to spend a little more on the switches. That's because the sound and the feel of the switches can be better depending on the materials of the housing, the stem-like variations, and even the spring can make a difference. So there are three types of switches, right? We have linear, tactile, and clicky. With a linear switch, you want to see how smooth the switch is and how it sounds when bottoming out, because there are no interferences and the stem goes straight down. With a tactile switch, you want to see how the bump feels and how it sounds, because not all tactile bumps sound the same. You also have no pre-travel and pre-travel switches, with the former being usually a little more satisfying to a typist. And as for the clicky switches, it's really all about the pitch of the click and a little bit of that tactility because it still is a tactile switch. Even just between budget-friendly clicky switches, all of them have different pitches, and once you get up into a higher price point, you get to experience some deeper clicks. So let's start off this comparison by starting at the housing, which is probably the most important part of any switch. Surprisingly, for the materials used, whether we're talking about cheap switches or super expensive switches, it's got pretty much the same materials. It's usually a polycarbonate top housing and a nylon bottom housing. Obviously, the quality of the polycarbonate and the nylon will be different depending on the brand and the price of the switch, but majority of the switches do share the same materials. Cherry, Gateron, Kale, and even Duroc all use very similar materials for the housings, despite the price ranges of the actual switches. But Durocs are also made by JWK, and JWK does produce a different kind of housing with UMP, which is a more durable plastic, and it's found on the C3 Tangerines and the Kiwis. This material supposedly makes the switch a little more smooth, and despite the Tangerines being the smoothest switch I've ever tried in my entire life, those are still factory lubes, so I can't say much about the stock smoothness of these UMP housings. And when we move to the top to the Zeal switches that are super expensive at around $1 a piece and higher, these housings are made with an undisclosed nylon blend which supposedly makes the housing smoother. Zeal switches are made by Gateron, but considering that the stock Telios and Zealios switches are smoother than your traditional cheap budget 20 cents Gateron switches, I think the housing does actually make the switch smoother. Meanwhile, all switch stems are made out of POM, so there's no differences there. Between the low, medium, and high price switches here, the only discernible difference is really the smoothness. But the price doesn't really dictate the smoothness either, because the 20-cent Gateron yellow switches are considered to be one of the smoothest switches after lubing them, potentially being the same as the $1 Telios switch, while the 65-cent Tangerines are just straight up the smoothest switch on the market without the need of a lube application. But then we also have our 75-cent Novel Keys creams as the exception. This switch is entirely made out of POM plastic, and since POM is slightly thicker and denser than your typical polycarbonate and nylon blends, it gives a distinct sound signature that is stockier than all other linear switches. But the one downside of the creams is that it's super scratchy from the very beginning. It's one of those switches that you have to lube and break in, and break-in time does not come quickly like Gateron yellows. With Gateron yellows, you can lube them and wait around 1 to 2 weeks of usage, and it'll be fully broken in. But with the creams, it's going to take you around 3 months or so before you actually notice and hear any difference. But I think that the sound signature is very worth it. I've been using it for around 4 months or so, and I really love the sound of the thockiness it makes. I personally think that the end result is worth it, but some of you may not. And we need to talk about the springs. You have silver springs, you have gold-plated springs, and you also have different compression styles of springs. But the only thing that I really care about is the spring ping. If you bottom out a switch and you hear a ping back, that's a bad spring. And budget mechanical keyboards are notorious for having spring ping because they use cheap switches. Razer keyboards are notorious for having spring ping, Royal Clutch keyboards have spring ping, Otemu keyboards have a lot of spring ping, you can check that video out. Just overall, cheap mechanical switches will definitely have a lot of spring ping. But that's not saying that the expensive switches won't have spring ping, because they do. Zeal switches have spring ping, Duroc switches have spring ping, and I think the only switches that I've not had spring ping on are the Gazoo Bobas, the silent ones, and the U4Ts, the Tangerines, and the Kiwis, and probably some other switch that I've tried in the past. But spring ping is definitely a huge issue, makes the keyboard not sound very good, and probably at the end of the day, whatever switch you buy, you're probably gonna have to take some time to lube up the springs to make the keyboard sound good. Unfortunately, materials is only half the story when it comes to the switches, because you also have to account for build quality, and the one thing we're going to be looking at is housing wobble. And this term refers to the tightness between the top and the bottom housing to see how much of a gap is created in the switch. The ideal switch will have no housing wobble whatsoever, even if you open it up to lube it. That's a good switch. And you might think that the more expensive a switch gets, the less housing wobble you'll see, but that is not true whatsoever. The most housing wobble I have ever seen is actually in the Xylence, which is the most expensive switch I have ever bought. $1.30 a piece with so much housing wobble. You can check out this video right here and you can see all that stem wobble for yourself. The only difference I've seen in terms of build quality between cheap and expensive switches is the durability in a hot swap keyboard. Some switches take a lot of effort to take out and the tabs end up getting destroyed, and this kind of issue does not happen often when the switches are on the mid-tier to high-end side. So with the build quality, with the cheap switches, the material is going to be a little more fragile, while the more expensive switches are going to be a little more durable. But unless you're going to be hot swapping over and over and pulling these switches out again and again, this won't matter as much. For smoothness, the more expensive switches are going to be slightly smoother than your cheap switches, but if you lube any of these switches and break them in, they're going to sound very similar with each other. I will say that the more expensive switches, or around the mid-tier price to the high expensive switches, are going to sound a little thockier just because of the durable material that it has compared to the fragile materials on the cheap switches. So conclusion time, should you be buying cheap switches or expensive switches, or does it really matter? At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. If you're someone like me who lubes all their switches when I get them, it really doesn't make a huge difference in terms of sound and smoothness, because smoothness can be fixed with lube, and the sound is derived from the material of the housing, and most of the housings are the same material. Of course, there are some switches that are definitely worth the price point that you're paying for. C3 Tangerines, the smoothest switch you'll ever find out there. Very smooth, factory lubed, very good build quality, you don't even have to break them in. Very awesome right off the bat. Kazoo Boba U4Ts, really nice tactility, really nice build quality, no spring ping, definitely a great buy. And honestly, you can't go wrong with a 20-cent Gateron yellow switch, because after you lube it, it's gonna feel like butter, and it's definitely on par with a lot of the smooth switches on the market that cost more. So it's definitely the best bang for your buck switch here. So my advice for you guys is to buy the cheap to mid-price switches and use some lube to increase the quality of them. They're going to sound and feel the same as those expensive switches, but you're going to save money in the process. Thanks for watching this video. If you guys have any questions or opinions about this topic, just leave it in the comments down below and we can talk there. And if you're looking for some budget switches, just check all the links in the description down below and you're going to find a bunch of selections to choose from. Also, I've got a full-time job that starts next week and ends in the first week of September, so I probably won't be able to upload a video every single week, but I will try to get a video out to you guys whenever I can. I'll see you guys later. Peace.